Hey everybody, it's Josh Ronquist here for Heavy Debriefings, and it is time to talk about my top 10 albums of 1996. Coming in at number 10 is Nevermore with the Politics of Ecstasy. The sophomore album from Nevermore feels like that perfect sweet spot of the early day Nevermore, where it's not too thrashy, it's not too proggy, it's not too dark, even though the lyrics are dark on every single Nevermore album. That's part of why I love them so much. But it feels like it's a nice, great pace of everything that's going on and parts of what you'll hear in future albums, but still just trying to figure out what the band is all about in this sophomore album. There's so much to love and appreciate about this thing, and it's an album that really goes underlooked, and that seems to happen with every album before Dead Heart in a Dead World, which is understandable because that is the band's best album. But don't be afraid to check out their 6-string albums, and by that I mean 6-string guitar albums, before they started incorporating the 7-string. There's some really good gems here, and the Politics of Ecstasy is absolutely one of them. Coming in at number 9 is Typo Negative with October Rust. And just like I mentioned with Typo Negative before, it's a little hard to talk about this band in a positive light because there's so many moments that happened before Peter Steele's death that just makes you want to tug your collar. But Peter Steele did at least seem to be sincerely sorry by the time that he did pass on about many of the things that he'd done in the past, so I tend to give him a little bit of a pass when it comes to that compared to other bands who feel they've done nothing wrong. But enough on that, let's get into what many consider to be the ultimate Typo Negative album. It's dark, it's heavy, it's catchy, it's got the song My Girlfriend's Girlfriend, which seems to be the red-hot-blooded American dream for every man. Wink wink, nudge nudge. It's just a fun album if you're able to escape all the politics aside from outside of what happened in the band. It's just a great album to listen to from start to finish. It's got that great tongue-in-cheek, dry humor that I appreciate so much. And this is really an album that does do that. I mean, just look at the track listing. It's just a fun album to listen to from start to finish. And again, if you can look over the whole artist versus art debate, which is a topic for a different video, I highly recommend checking out this album. Coming in at number 8 is one of my favorite underappreciated bands of all time, with Galactic Cowboys and Machine Fish. The third album from this band, possibly their most popular album. I mean, it's kind of hard to say when the whole band's discography is very underappreciated, but what I do love about this album is they really feel like they found themselves on this album. It's that great mix of King's X meets the Beatles meets Metallica. It gets super heavy at times. It's got some of the catchiest backing and lead vocals that you're ever going to hear on an album, and it's got some great groove, prog, a little bit of thrash moments going on, and it's all relatively the pop sensibility of shorter songs. I mean, there isn't anything that goes past 7 minutes here. Usually it's in the 3 to 5 minute range. It's just that nice little sweet spot where no matter your style of music, you're able to find something to appreciate about this. And if you appreciate anything in the rock, hard rock, and even Beatles pop rock, you'll find something to appreciate here with the Galactic Cowboys. Coming in at number 7 is Godspeed You, Black Emperor, with F-sharp, A-sharp, Infinity. I apologize for the infinity sign not being in there. I typed it in, but for some reason, it's not showing up. But the debut album from Godspeed really does showcase what the band was all about when they first started off. And even though many might consider this to be the weakest Godspeed album, I have a huge soft spot for it because I feel like they nailed everything that they were trying to achieve. It's got that great cinematic feel behind it. It's one of the first albums that you go to when you think of the post-rock movement and what it is nowadays. It feels like a gigantic soundtrack. I mean, the fact that a song like Providence feels like a half-hour soundtrack to the city of Providence, I think it says a lot about it. But this isn't going to be for everybody. There's no real lyrics to this. If there's any vocals at all, it's usually spoken word or sound clips that are going on. It's not going to be for everybody, but for those that appreciate the post-rock sound, that can appreciate soundtrack-style movements, that can appreciate cinematic moments, this is an album that is a must. And this isn't the only time you're going to see Godspeed in this list. I can guarantee you that. Coming in at number 6 is In Flames with one of their most seminal albums, The Jester Race. Now, this is the album that is not only the sophomore album from the band, not only the first time that Jesper really shows up, not only is this one of the most seminal Swedish melodeath albums of all time, it is also one of the best In Flames albums of all time. This has everything. It's got the right amount of folk, it's got the right amount of death metal, it's got that melodic death metal sound that, while it's still in its infancy for what it would become, so many bands were influenced by this particular album. And many would say even more by the next album, Horacle. I still gotta give it to Jester Race. And you can see me talk all about this in the In Flames Backwards Marathon I did not too long ago. But seriously, mid-90s, melodeath, In Flames, you can't ask for much more. This is an album that some would consider to even be overhyped, but it's worth all of that hype. It really is one of the best albums of Swedish melodic death metal to ever come out of the 90s. Go check it out and see why. Coming in at number 5 was, for a long time, the Swan Song for Carcass. Ahaha with Swan Song. And wow, this is one of the most polarizing albums of the melodeath scene. And the reason I say that is, if you've ever checked out Swan Song, it is not melodic death metal. It is not grindcore. It is not what you know Carcass to be at the time. This was death and roll. And one of the finest examples of death and roll. One of the first ones that truly stood out to me. And it really is a fantastic album. I know many people might disagree, but I feel differently. The songs are so catchy, they are heavy in the right spots, you do hear some death growls once in a while. I mean, it's never really clean singing, but all of the lyrics are understandable. It's just a nice heavy album that doesn't really get into blast beats or great melodic death metal moments. It's a heavy rock, metal, almost death metal, almost melodic death metal album. And if that sounds like something to you, I think it's a perfect starter album if you don't know anything about melodic death metal. Seriously, give it a shot. I mean it. Ah yes, at number 4, one of the most misunderstood concept albums of all time. Devin Townsend's Punky Brewster, Cooked on Phonics. The story of a Polish death metal band that breaks a string on stage and becomes one of the greatest punk rock bands of all time. It is so tongue-in-cheek, there's so much dry humor, so much sarcasm, but the songs are so good. And I really don't know how Devin feels about this album nowadays, but when I listen to it, it takes me back to those 90s punk rock albums that I do appreciate so much. And while it's not the best writing Devin has ever done, and I think he would even say the same, the songs are just short, fun, catchy, wrapped around a almost cohesive, almost convoluted story. You get the gist of what's going on. If you can understand what is going on, especially if you knew what was happening in the 90s back then, you'll get a great laugh out of this. And just seeing everything that happens in the name of selling out, I highly recommend that if you enjoy a comedy album of death metal turned punk rock, check out Punky Brewster, Cooked on Phonics. Coming in at number 3 is Catatonia with Brave Murder Day, and this is the last album that really incorporates any kind of death metal into their sound. From here on out, there's a little bit of doom, but it's mainly more gothic metal, and if you want to know a little bit more about that, I did a backwards marathon on Catatonia, which you can check out on this very channel. But yes, all the screams and growls on this album are done by Michael Akerfeld of Opeth, while Jonas does the clean vocals. And the album is based on the very first 3 songs, Brave, Murder, Day. And you can see the band wanting to make that full-on change into what they would later become. This is the last dying breaths of that death metal sound, and I think of the early albums, this is the best one that incorporates that death metal sound. And if you don't believe me, all you need to do is hear the one and only Michael Akerfeld doing those screams and growls for the band. Seriously, this is an album that is so worth checking out, and I highly recommend that you do, especially if you don't know your older Catatonia. Coming in at number 2 is the debut album from Nightingale, which started off originally as just a one-man project by the legendary Dan Swano, and the album The Breathing Shadow. Especially if you know the latter-day Nightingale albums, this album is a drastic difference from what the band became, as this album is much more of that 80s goth rock sound, and little touches of progressive here and there, but especially if you listen to the latter day albums, you definitely hear that prog influence shine high and mighty. But I gravitate towards this album so much because I love that 80s goth sound that he's able to pull off here. He's got the voice for it. I love the fact that he did everything on this album except he used a drum machine on this album. So it's the only one without real drums on it. But it doesn't matter, it just has that great aesthetic behind it. And of course, he's one of my biggest heroes, Dan Swano. And Nightingale is one of my favorite projects of his. And I almost feel like at number 1, I should talk about maybe my favorite release from Dan Swano, which just so happens to be Edge of Sanity with Crimson. The 40-minute epic where, if you listen to it digitally, it's split up into several tracks. If you get the original release, it's one long 40-minute track. And if you get the vinyl, it's split in half. So, yeah, no, you can make the argument it's just one song. To me, it's a full-on album. And it's my favorite release from Edge of Sanity. It is possibly the most perfect, conceptual, progressive death metal album. And the only one that even comes close is an album that I'll be talking about in 2003 with Crimson 2, the sequel to this album. And just like Catatonia that I mentioned before, Michael Akerfeldt does the screams and growls on this album while Dan Swano takes care of the clean vocals. Michael Akerfeldt was a busy boy during this album in between Opeth albums. And I can't say it enough, this is my favorite conceptual, melodic, progressive death metal album of all time. Nothing else even comes close. And if you want to know what I love about this style, this album is the perfect representation. And that does it for my top 10 albums of 1996. What do you think? What are your top 10 albums of 1996? And if you'd like to agree, disagree, or just tell me how wrong I am for my own personal opinion, comment down below and tell me everything I need to know. And of course, like, comment, share, subscribe, and everything else to be able to help this channel grow. I really hope that it can at some point. I'm doing the best that I can. I'm a one-man operation. Please help. Please and thank you. And until the next top 10 backwards marathon, interview, review, or any other kind of video I put up here on the Heavy Debriefings YouTube channel, this is Josh Runkelwitz saying, see ya.